everybody. It's really lovely to be here, and I've kind of been part of this story of the Festival of Windrush, having been commissioned. Really grateful to have been commissioned to create that artwork, and then the artwork for this year as well. But I'm going to talk a bit about my work campaigning against what became known as the Windrush scandal, and why I created this illustrated timeline. So, as a multidisciplinary artist, but also an activist and campaigner, the two for me have always gone hand in hand. So I use my creative practice as a platform to campaign for equality, freedom, justice and human rights. And during the course of work that I've done as an activist, in my organisation, Black Activists Rising Against Cuts, BARAC UK, which I co-founded with Leigh Day in 2010, and with African, Caribbean and Asian Lawyers for Justice and Windrush groups, which Jacqui was very much involved in. I have used my art, my poetry, my creative writing to document the scandal, document the activism, document the stories of people who are impacted, and try to amplify voices and get messages out to different audiences, you know, on different platforms than I do when I'm speaking or protesting or organising a demonstration, but sometimes those things interlink and cross over with each other, because I might be designing, like for this, the flyer of a protest that we're doing about a deportation flight going. So I was fortunate to be selected to be an artist in residence at Santa Fe Art Institute in New Mexico in the USA over the summer during August and September. And the overall theme for the residency was sovereignty. And I'm going to share a quote that the Institute used in terms of defining sovereignty, which I feel is quite different to how we might perceive sovereignty when we're looking at it in the UK, with the legacies of colonialism and the enslavement of our ancestors and African people, and having a royal family, you know, in this country. And Simone Lee, who is an African-American artist based in the USA, this is her quote that the Institute used for the theme. To be sovereign is to not be subject to another's gaze, but rather to be the author of one's own history. And so there were multidisciplinary artists attending Santa Fe during the course of the year, and they interpreted sovereignty very differently. In fact, there were a number of Native American artists involved who have a different perspective of sovereignty in terms of trying to take ownership of their own land and maintain their own cultures in the face of colonialism. But I decided that I would explore the theme of sovereignty through both the Windrush scandal, but also the Windrush generation and their contribution to the UK. And I think that for me and for many people who are creative, part of our resilience is demonstrated through our creativity. Sometimes that's how we feel empowered, that's how we have strength, and sometimes it's the healing that keeps us going. So whilst I can be creating art or writing about quite heavy subjects and things that are traumatizing and impact on me and my family and our history, actually the process of creating something about it has a sense of healing, sometimes closure, and sometimes just a way of screaming out, you know, so rather than just shouting the odds, it goes into a piece of art or a poem, for example. So one of the big pieces that I worked on is this illustrated timeline, and I wanted to document the backstory to the Windrush scandal, how it came about, the pieces of law that were introduced that led to people coming and settling in the UK, but also the historical atrocities, the experience for enslavement and colonialism that gave us that link with the UK. And that's why there's a sort of, there's a little piece of art in there that says, you know, we are here because they were there. In the spirit of reclaiming narrative, which is the theme for Black History Month this year, I also wanted to document my own personal involvement in campaigning. So I mentioned that BARAC UK was established in 2010, but in 2012 we started campaigning specifically around an immigration act that was being proposed, which we knew would impact on new migrant communities to the UK and overseas students, for example. But we also recognised in looking at what was being proposed that it was going to impact on more established migrant communities, including the Windrush generation. And we started warning at that time and organising a campaign, and came together with trade unions and many migrant rights and race equality groups to form a campaigning organisation called Movement Against Xenophobia. Some of you might recall the big billboard posters in tube and train stations and bus stations, which had the slogan, "I am an immigrant," and had huge photos of real people saying, "I'm a bus driver, I'm a builder, I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, and I came to the UK and this is what I've contributed to British society," which was our way of trying to counter the narrative that was there, that migrant communities in the UK are here to steal all the jobs and steal all the housing, when actually the economy would collapse if it were not for migrant labour and migrant communities, not just over recent decades, but over centuries. So you can see, like, it's really busy, that side of the timeline. And that represents the flurry of activity and the amount of things that we had to respond to in a very short space of years because of the onslaught of attacks. So it's documenting BARAC being established, the movement against xenophobia being established, campaigning against the Windrush scandal as well as exposing it. And I first wrote something in The Guardian 2 years before it became known as the Windrush scandal, which was headlined, "How can 50 people be snatched and deported to Jamaica?" And that's when we first became aware of a mass deportation to Jamaica, where people were literally snatched up, and the turnaround was only like a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, between people being grabbed, detained, and actually stuck on flights. We've really very little time, no time to even process what was happening to them and the trauma of it, let alone try and get legal representation. And Jacqui will tell you, we've spent many nights when a deportation flight is going up all night trying to get people off flights, and successfully getting people off flights for a joint effort of activists, lawyers, taking last-minute legal action to get people removed. Sometimes people are in touching distance of the plane, even in their seat, before we've got them off those planes. And that really takes a toll on people. You don't hear much of those stories. And I have tried to, through this residency, document those stories, document the experiences people went through, but also try and bring some of the joy. So some of the artwork I created are around the Notting Hill Carnival, portraits of people. And also when you go in that room where I've got stuff on display, and there are lots of things there for sale as well. I have another large artwork I did on my residency of Moko Jumbis and the history behind that and why they're a prominent figure at Caribbean carnivals. And even down to January. The timeline finishes in January of this year, where there's an ongoing campaign still calling for compensation. A lot of people think that the Windrush scandal is finished. You know, the government apologised. They did a compensation scheme. But the reality is that the vast majority of people haven't received compensation. If they've been awarded it, they found that they need to appeal. Many people haven't even applied because the process of doing it is so complex and difficult, and people are, you know, elderly. So it's a lot to have to deal with going through that process. Some people just want to just have a few years of peace after what they've been through and not have to go through the process of applying. And all the way around the edge of the timeline, you will see there are names, and some of them have a name, an RIP, signifying that they are people that have now passed on and are no longer with us, and haven't even benefited, if you could even call it benefiting, from having some compensation and perhaps, you know, being able to do something with that, something joyful with that money, if they received it. So I wanted to honour the memories. By no means does it obviously document thousands of people impacted, but some well-known names and some lesser-known names are around that timeline, because I wanted us to remember the people who were impacted. But at the beginning, as you can see, I wanted to actually document what happened when people came to the UK. Why did they come to the UK? Because of enslavement. The great profit the UK made of enslaving African people. The hostile environment, we talk about a hostile environment in recent years, but there was a hostile, racist, vile environment when people arrived in the 50s and 60s and were effectively told to go back and they weren't welcome. And I've documented, you know, the Bristol bus boycott in there as an example, just one example of racism that black people faced in the UK, black and brown people faced in the UK, but also the Bristol bus boycott led to race legislation, which protected people's rights in the second set of legislation in employment, amongst other areas. And I think very often that link is not told in stories, so I wanted to include that. How am I doing for time? I'm okay? Okay. So I think that, you know, we've done a lot of talking and writing about the Windrush scandal, and I felt that producing something like this that's visual, that I can take around, that's why I've, you know, done it on cloth, on canvas cloth. This is actually the same canvas that we used to create the huge Windrush Day of Action banner, which we dropped in a banner drop over Westminster Bridge when we had our Day of Action that Jacqui was at and many others were at, which was about, I think it was about 10 times the size of that one. It took up the whole of the road to hold it, and several people were walking down Whitehall. You know, there was no room virtually on either side because it needed to be quite big. And that banner, that original banner, was made by members of the community. Actually, going to those meetings and workshops was now a member of your team, yeah, Jerome, Leigh Day, who was still a student at that time, and also members of the Windrush community, activists, students, all different ages were involved in painting that banner and creating it and attending the workshops, including Hubert Howard, who's no longer with us, was also participating in that, who's a member of the Windrush generation who was impacted by this scandal horrifically. So I just feel like that's a way that we can present to people what happened, why did it happen, what's the history of it, where are we now, what have we done, because it's important to document what we have done and the involvement that we have had and all the protests and activism, because the UK government didn't just apologise in a vacuum. It wasn't because a white journalist for a prominent paper, wrote about people's stories. It was the communities, and it was black communities and Caribbean communities and groups of lawyers and activist groups led by black activists and community members in different cities and towns, because that day of action we did wasn't just in London. I coordinated a national day of action, and there were simultaneous direct actions in 8 different cities across the UK. And very often we don't hear what we did ourselves, what actually people who are directly impacted by the Windrush scandal becoming activists, not because they chose to become activists, but they found themselves needing to in order to represent, to tell their story, but also to bring some strength and solidarity for other people who were impacted. So I'd invite you, I'm not going to go through and talk about every little bit of the timeline, but during the course of the evening, please feel free to have a look at it and look through it, and then I'll be out on the stall if you've got any questions then, but of course we're going to take questions now. I'm happy to answer any questions that you've got, and do come and look at the stall. There's lots of things that are there for sale, including copies of my book and different merchandise and original art pieces and prints. Feel free to browse, you don't have to buy, just come and have a look and look through what's there. It's there as a sort of exhibit as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions for Zita about her artwork or anything that she's been mentioning? Sure.
You said that the latest part on your canvas is from January this year, and it's clear you're running out of room.
Yes, I am. I'll have to do another one.
So yeah, that was my question. Are you going to be starting another one soon?
I don't think I'll start one soon, but I will definitely do another one. I think I would probably want to, reflect back after a couple of years, or perhaps actually it might be a good idea to just document things as they're happening. One single artwork like this, because I've done that throughout the whole period, but in different pieces of work, whether it's written or artwork. So perhaps you've given me a good idea to just keep one running constantly and add to it as activities happen. Because actually, one of the things that I did, although I've kind of lived and breathed the latter part from 2010 onwards, was very much my own story as much as everybody's story. It did take me some time while I was on the residency just to do all the research and make sure I had the facts, the figures, the quotes, looking at documents and so on. So it's not a bad idea to do what you suggested and do it as I go along.
Yeah, because I think this would be great in schools and places like that. It's brilliant.
Thank you. Yeah, I've taken it to some schools. Yeah.
Is it available in pamphlets or?
I haven't done that yet. Yeah.
I was just thinking about the question that Sean's asking.
Yeah.
It would be really quite useful to have it in all the schools and so can have, apart from having it as a display.
Yeah, I have it on a slide. So actually,
Right.
I've taken it into a school and presented it as part of a slideshow on the Windrush scandal. Yeah.
I have questions really. One of the things that we don't hear about, we have discussions when the Windrush, is the reactions of the countries that people were being removed to. And I just wondered, did you come across that in your research? What was, for example, the Jamaican government saying? What was the Belgian government saying? What was the feedback?
So that's an interesting one because as you probably know, that if people were being deported to the Caribbean, they were gathered up and taken to Jamaica and then onward to whatever country they were born in. So a lot of our focus was around Jamaica because that's where the plane was landing. And we had basically quite a horrible experience people went through. Yeah, so because of the things the UK government was saying, and saying that these people being deported are all the worst type of criminals there are, so they're rapists and murderers. And actually, if you were to look at everybody on, come in, on any given plane, you would find that maybe there's one person that falls into that category, but people were criminalised by virtue of their immigration status. Other people were getting a double punishment because if they had been in the prison system, they had served their time. If they'd been born in the UK, they would be allowed to come out of prison, be rehabilitated and get on with their life. But by virtue of not being born in the UK, they come to the UK at 6 months old, which a lot of people did. They were small babies and toddlers. They were still told, well, you can be deported now as well, so we can take you from prison, detain you. So we had the announcements by British government, followed by the right-wing press, with these screaming headlines about the most horrific criminals being deported on these planes. So the stigma attached to individuals when they were deported was that these were the worst people in society. We don't want them in our country. So them trying to get housing, trying to get jobs, let alone try and navigate the system and still try to look at how can we get back to the UK and fight our legal case, but how are we going to survive in this country was quite horrific. So we had contact with some charities on the ground, and even when we look at who we were talking to and who were willing to talk to us, they weren't willing to do it publicly because they were fearful about the impact on them, but also they might be accessing some funding streams from the government there in order to deliver the service of helping people settle back into the country. But what we did have is we had one of the High Commissioners of Jamaica in the UK who did come on board and was more vocal than some others and spoke out a bit and represented. In fact, in the early hours of the morning, I had to get him out of bed because of some people were being deported on a flight and say, I need you to use your influence because I'm not getting anywhere, you know, as an activist here, but as a High Commissioner of Jamaica, can you do something about this? So I remember running through with him who he needed to contact, what he needed to say in the middle of the night, but he did it, you know, he did respond and he hosted some events at the High Commission, but there have been other countries that have refused to allow such charter flights to land in their countries, and that's really what we wanted to see and didn't see, which was unfortunate and pretty bad.
Well, perhaps, I'm sure people will have more questions for Zita and we'll look, oh, Sonia, okay, I'll take this as the last question.
Yeah, thanks. Right. I wonder if my questions already linked to the two questions that have been asked about those countries that people deported to. And I wonder, prior to the mass deportations, the people had been deported before. We weren't aware, I mean, it hadn't hit the Guardian when it did. But I came into contact with families. I worked as a local councillor in West Norwood. And I came into contact with families coming for support from their MPs because members of the family had been deported in 2016. And I just wonder, you know, with those countries, has there been anything set up to support those people, i.e. the government set up with Jamaican government to support those people being deported? Because I still feel that there's some people we've lost along the way. People are still struggling in Jamaica without any support and possibly not realising that they were wrongly deported because people made to feel they've done something wrong is what's around with families. They thought it was their fault that they were being deported. So the question is whether the government has done anything to support those people and you have a connection, or whether they're aware of who these people are.
Absolutely, there were people being deported before the mass deportation charter flights we became aware of. in their ones or twos or threes. And one of the things that I was heavily involved in is targeting particular airlines. And we found out what airline people are on. There will be an immediate reaction. So if there's 2 or 3 people on a passenger flight, you can do a call out once you know what airline it is and what flight it is, to say to passengers they should resist. And there have been some protests by passengers around that, but very often people don't, if we don't know and we can't amplify their voices and get a message out on social media quite urgently, those people can be unnoticed on that flight, even though they are cuffed and chained to people stewarding them on that flight, security stewarding them. They'll be somewhere quite discreet and you won't necessarily notice. Perhaps if you're sitting very close to them, you'll get wind of it, but generally you wouldn't. So I talked about from 2010, but actually, good 10 years or more before that, I've been involved in trying to stop, and it hasn't just been like Windrush related cases. Sometimes it's people that have fled persecution from different countries and are being deported. But in terms of what countries did to support, well, they got some financing from the British government, but when you talk to individuals on the ground about how good or how supportive that was, it's supposed to get them, sort of recondition them into society in that country and know how to navigate whatever processes they need for their legal status in the country and accessing services and so on. So it is there, but it will differ from place to place. And once it's finished, people are pretty much on their own. So if you have a family member there who is able to take you on, then they might have a roof over their head. But other people, I've had people contacting me in the middle of the night saying, I've been chucked out of this, halfway house type of housing, and I've got nowhere to go, or I've got no food, and I'm contacting independent charities on the ground in those countries, not the ones that are resourced and supported and funded, to say, can you do something to help this individual tonight, and give them a meal and a bed for the night. So how the money was distributed wasn't great. The stigma attached to people meant that people were reluctant to support and help those individuals because they're assuming they're this horrific criminal that the British government and the right-wing press here are saying. So they were pretty much isolated, and we've heard lots of cases of people that have taken their lives or have been killed after being deported as well, sadly.
Thank you very much, Zita. We'll give you a round of applause here.